I just wanted to say they always bring me in to give the sobering news. Kids Count, some of you may not be familiar with. It's a project at the national level with the Annie E. Casey Foundation. It started in 1989 with a national book looking at child well-being across the 50 states. In 1992, Michigan published its first book and looked at child well-being across the 83 counties in the state. We now look at multiple communities as well across the state on an array of indicators from the birth certificate. So we keep trying to pull together pictures, profiles of what children look like, what the well-being of children looks like in our state and in our local communities. So why do we do this? The first is that we need to set meaningful goals, and those of you in the business community know about data. You use data to make decisions about what you're going to do in your business. We need to do the same thing with our children when we make public policies and invest in programs. We need to identify those who are left behind, and the Casey Foundation was founded on the principle to improve the lives of disadvantaged children. And the Casey Foundation felt that one of the most powerful ways to do that was to publish information about the well-being of children on an ongoing basis. So, in Michigan, we annually conduct a public information campaign to keep in front of the media, lawmakers, and the general public what's happening to our children. We need to maintain our focus on the next generation. To quote a cliche, they are the future of our economy and of our social structure here in the state. There are 10 core indicators in Kids Count. 5 of them come from Vital Statistics, and 5 of them come from the American Community Survey, which is an ongoing survey collecting data about social and economic conditions throughout the country. Michigan, on those 10 indicators, ranks in the top 15 on 3 indicators. You'll notice right away it's teen births, child deaths, the mortality indicators we look quite good at. We're hovering right around in the middle on some of the other indicators, percent low birth weight babies, percent of teens not attending school and not working. Where our challenges are in 3 very vital areas. The percent of children in poverty. I'm going to talk pretty extensively about that. Our infant mortality rate, which is really troubling. We're not making substantial progress on that and haven't since the mid-90s. And the last is the percent of children under the age of 18 where no parent has a full-time year-round job. And after we've been looking at the unemployment numbers in Michigan, that's no news either. So what are the trends? If we look at the trends rather than the ranks, we have very good news. We see that we're moving in the right direction on most of them. The one where we're really falling off the charts is this 36% increase in child poverty. So the overview is, in economic security, we're worsening in Michigan. Health is a very mixed bag. Because of the economic conditions that children are living in, the mortality rates for teens and children are fairly well ranked, but that infant mortality rate, again, is very troubling. And we see improvements for teens. So when we talk about child poverty, when we talk about poverty, what does that mean? And I always like to put this little table up so that people actually have an idea of what the money is. We're looking at roughly $17,000 gross annual income when we talk about poverty for a single parent mom with 2 children, which is sort of the norm. For 2 parents, around $22,000, 2 parents and 2 children under the age of 18. What poverty researchers tell us that at that level of income, below and even above that level of income, families are struggling. And when poverty researchers talk about economic insecurity, they really place it at under 200% of poverty, which is to say double the poverty level. At the Michigan League for Human Services, we've costed out what people need to spend in Michigan on average for their health care, for preschool childcare if they need it, for food, for shelter, for transportation. It comes out to roughly 230% of the poverty level. So families that are in this zone are really in a fragile economic situation. The other troubling finding is when we look across at what happens to children in poverty, we see vast inequities in terms of the racial, ethnic diversity in the state. It's absolutely shocking, to me anyway, to think that 44% of our young children in the African American community, that's almost 1 of every 2, is living below the poverty level. We're not talking about 200% of poverty, we're talking about the poverty level. And keep in mind what I just mentioned to you about what that means. And roughly half of Native American children are living in families that have income below the poverty level. These families often face disparities in birth outcomes too, which puts another burden on the family. Preterm births, babies born too soon, low birth weight babies, babies born weighing less than 5.5 pounds, those are disproportionately in our minority communities as well, particularly the African American community. And when you think of the burden on a low-income woman of having a small baby, maybe born preterm with lots of complications, and also trying to work and not being able to put together much of an income, and always having that stress level of trying to take care of a baby that's so marginal. You can see also we have vast differences in teen birth rates, and I think this really speaks to the opportunities that young people see before them. Even though Michigan has one of the best teen birth rates, or lowest teen birth rates in the country, I think we always need to keep in front of us that as a country, we have double the teen birth rate of the next highest industrialized country, which would be the UK. So while we can celebrate the fact that we're making progress on it, we still have a long way to go. We have roughly 10,000 babies born every year to a teenager in Michigan. Just think about what that means. The other issue I wanted to raise for you is, where are these child poverty trends going? The data that I just showed you from the National Book was through 2007. The data that are now available through 2009 show an even bleaker picture. You can see that between 2008 and 2009, we saw a pretty substantial increase in child poverty. And it doesn't look as if this is going to get any better. When we look at the end of 2009 compared to 2000, at the percent of unemployed who were long-term unemployed, that is, they had been unemployed for 26 weeks, we see a jump from roughly 6% to 41% of long-term unemployed. And all this discussion in the media about extending unemployment benefits, this is huge for Michigan. We have a lot of people who will fall off without some assistance. Child poverty is not just an urban problem. I think people always jump to the conclusion, well, that's just in the big cities that we have child poverty. Well, I urge you to look across the top of Michigan. We have profound poverty in our rural areas as well as in pockets of our urban counties. So there's a lot of issues with transportation, with housing, and with isolation in these communities. When we look at what the connections are for poverty, why do we care so much about poverty? Poverty has an impact across the board on all domains of child well-being. We have access to the National Survey of Child Health, and we are able to look at data specific to Michigan. And when we look at families below 200% of poverty, compared to those families above 200% of poverty, you can see on the far left, the bar, roughly 28% of those families in low-income, those children in low-income families are living in a neighborhood with a lot of dilapidated housing. So not only do they get the poverty within their own family, but within their neighborhood, the physical structure is not conducive to being a very nice place to live. The other issue, which I think is even more profound, is that 25%, one of every 4 families in this, in low-income families, there's nobody in the neighborhood that they can turn to when they have difficulties. There's no support system. There's no social network that they feel they can access. So the layering of disadvantage and the concentration of poverty in neighborhoods and where people live is a huge issue that begs for some programming and policy. The other issues is the health, the overall health, which is not surprising. When you look at those children below 200, living in families with income below 200% of poverty, roughly half of them are described by their parent as being in very good or excellent health, compared to 72% of children who live in families above the poverty level. Also, ironically, the weight issue, that's a huge issue now, the obesity and what the implications are for diabetes, heart disease, general physical well-being. And this also is concentrated in our low-income neighborhoods. And people say, well, why would that be? Why would poor children be obese? Well, because their parents can't afford to buy them nutritious food, so they buy them filler food that fills them up and gives them energy, but doesn't really provide them the nutrient base that they need, which is another compounding factor when you have children living in neighborhoods, dilapidated housing, lead paint, and if these kids don't have the amount of calcium and iron in their diet, they're highly susceptible to getting lead as well. So what are we doing? What kind of safety net do we have in place for these families that are tumbling into poverty? Well, this is the cash assistance grant, which was designed for families that had children under the age of 18, but didn't have access to the unemployment system. Often women that work part-time and put several part-time jobs together. And over the course of the last 15 years, you can see what's happened to this. The minimum cash assistance grant has basically stayed about the same, $492. At the same time, the cost of housing has gone up precipitously, $805. It used to be, when the cash assistance grant was put in place, that housing was vendored out of the cash assistance grant, and there was still money left over for parents to buy clothes and paper products and transportation. And you can see that's definitely no longer the case. So the safety net has not kept pace with inflation in terms of either the eligibility or the grant level. The eligibility level has been held to $810. Once you make a gross amount of $810 a month, you are no longer eligible. I'll refer you back to the poverty chart. Poverty level for a family of 3 is roughly $1,200 a month. So we have many families that are in poverty, desperate poverty, but no longer qualified for the cash assistance grant. Okay, so what's happening to the same with the minimum wage? You can see that a minimum wage job no longer lifts a family above the poverty level. In 1979, the minimum wage lifted a family of 4 above the poverty level. That's no longer the case. Not surprisingly, Michigan is seeing some escalation in abuse and neglect, which is tightly tied to poverty level, neglect and abuse. And you can see that, again, we have a lot of abuse and neglect in our northern counties where we have high poverty rates. And most disconcerting is that young children, if you put those 2 bars together on the left, the far left are infants under the age of 1, and then the second bar, which represents 7,000 children, 7,600 actually, are ages 1 to 4. These are children who are the most vulnerable. and why it is so critical to have supports in place for those young families from the very beginning, because without that kind of support, this is what you see. You see parents unable to cope with young children and young children suffering. The last slide, rush through this, is the end game. And I wanted to leave you with the reading report. You each have a copy on with your folder. The reading report is Casey's 10-year commitment. Casey is maintaining that if a child cannot read proficiently by the end of the 3rd grade, they are going to struggle. Because after the 3rd grade, you have to read in order to learn. I suggest that Michigan needs to take this on as a way of measuring the impact of our programming and our efforts for young children. Right now, Michigan maintains that 84% of our children can read at a proficient level, 84% of our 3rd graders. But if you look in the reading report, Michigan, as it compares to the national test, we're like the 3rd or 4th lowest standard in the country. I show you on the right side of that chart what percentage the NAEP considers we have proficient. So we have a huge difference in what's considered proficient at the national level and the international level compared to what the MEP is measuring. We are now moving into a new era in education where we're going to have common core standards. We're talking about national standards across the country, and Michigan has signed on to that, which is a great step forward because our Michigan kids we need to know. We need to know proficient. What is proficient? And we need to agree on a national standard so our kids can feel proficient compared to their other kids in other states. Lastly, where to find more information. Those of you who are in counties or communities, you can log on to www.milh.org and you can get access to the actual data book. You can also log on to the National Data Center and go to Michigan where you can find counties, cities, which includes townships, all townships with 25,000 or more, as well as congressional district information. So there's a wealth of information about kids, and we need to be using it to make decisions about what kind of policies, what kinds of investments we're going to make, because Michigan really needs to buck it up in order to help more kids be successful earners, learners, readers, and ultimately parents of the next generation. Thank you.